It started recording, okay.
Okay.
So I will try to share my screen. Now, here it is. Can you see it? I guess you can.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess everyone can see it. I will try to make it bigger. Is it better now? Is it bigger now?
Yeah, that's full screen.
Great, great. So I guess that this is comfortable for everyone.
Yep.
As you can see, I would like to discuss with you the way we should or we could translate the Greek term Stοιχείωσις, found in the title of Proclus to Stοιχείωσις, to Elementationes. And of course, at first glance, I think that this seems to be a theological problem, but it is my impression or conviction that to solve it, we will definitely have to invoke some philosophical aspects of the whole enterprise of writing in the style of Elementatio, of Stοιχείωσις. So I think this somehow justifies the theological aspect of this discussion. I'm sorry, I have to admit someone in the... okay, I think I did it. Because I'm still the host, so... but I would like to... I'm sorry, I can't go back to my previous... sorry. Okay, I couldn't turn back to the previous slide. So my main claim, what I would like to share with you, is that of all the translations that have been suggested, there are two that I mostly prefer, and I would like to discuss why I do so. These are the Latin term Elementatio and the German Grundlegung, which I find to be these two the most accurate ways of rendering the term Stοιχείωσις.
Got it, but first you'll have to unlock your device.
So I have tried to specify some reasons for this view, for this idea. I would like to discuss with you 3 or 4 reasons and end up with a historical example from the 18th century, from Immanuel Kant, which also helps in our problem. Let me start with the first reason. When we translate the Greek term Stοιχείωσις as elements, the main problem for me is that we reduce the whole vision of Elementatio to one of the means with which the whole project of Elementatio is carried out. What I mean is that if we read the commentary on Euclid, and primarily the second prologue, which I take it to be something like the theory of Stοιχείωσις, so the theoretical background of writing such a text, we will see that Proclus is very careful when talking about elements. The term element is supposed to designate certain theorems, so we don't have an explicit definition of elements in the second prologue, but the elements are somehow the way with which we qualify the theorems that are the most important in an Elementatio, but they are not the only ones. So we have theorems, theoremata, which are called elements. Now the full screen, I'm afraid, doesn't allow you to see the whole. I'm afraid. Can you see the whole text? Because in my screen it's not visible.
I think we can see the whole text.
Okay.
I can see the reference numbers at least.
Okay, because I see your faces, so I can't see the whole text, but it's okay. So some theorems are called elements, and these are the elements that are taken in the title of the work. But there are also 2 additional classes of theorems, the elementary theorems, and also a third category, which we will immediately see. So this is the whole Greek text of the exposition of Proclus with regard to these theorems. And it is here that we find the criterion for the distinction between these three classes. The criterion is quantitative and has to do with the fact that what makes elements, the theorems that are elements, so important is the fact that they penetrate the whole epistemic domain that is exposed in this Elementatio. So the theorems that are elements are the first to come, let's say, and the last to live in an Elementatio, because they penetrate all the following theorems. They are a presupposition for all that comes after them. While what makes elementary theorems less important than the elements theorems is that they penetrate not the whole epistemic domain. So this is the Greek mi prospasan. They are not necessary, let's say, for all the following theorems, but are necessary, of course, for many of them. And there is a last class that Proclus does not pay much attention to, a third class of theorems which do not penetrate many of the theorems and which do not say something very elegant. So I'm sorry, I'm trying. Oh, is someone trying to enter the because I see in the chat some.
No, I'm
okay,
sorry. I think
sorry.
that can you read it?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I thought that someone was asking to enter the debate. Sorry. So we have these three classes of theorems, of which the theorems that are elements are only one of them. So when you translate the Stοιχείωσις as elements, you reduce the project of Stοιχείωσις to one of the means whereby this project is supposed to take place. So from the Greek text we have just seen, I think we can conclude quickly that what makes elements crucial, I do not deny this, of course, is their doctrinal pervasiveness. They pervade the whole epistemic domain. So they are omnipresent in Stοιχείωσις, and of course they are a precious tool at the service of a broader vision. The broader vision I'm talking about is exactly the Stοιχείωσις. The Stοιχείωσις, at least as I understand it, is not exhausted, and I think Proclus is clear on this. Stοιχείωσις is not exhausted in the means with which we try to carry it out. Stοιχείωσις is something much broader, much richer than the theorems that are elements, which are undoubtedly the most important tool with which we will carry out Stοιχείωσις. But what remains true for me is that Proclus intentionally calls his enterprise Stοιχείωσις because we know that behind this philosophical tradition there is a clear educational vision. This is also clear in the second prologue. Proclus and anyone who writes Stοιχείωσις wishes to instruct someone, to initiate students or readers who are inexperienced in a field with which they are not familiar. And it is exactly this ambition that is expressed by the term Stοιχείωσις. The Stοιχεία, the elements, are the way, one of the most important ways with which you will reach your end, but the end is something greater than the means that you use. So the second reason, if the first reason is that the translation reduces the Stοιχείωσις to one of its means. The second reason why I find it problematic is that we neglect the importance of the philosophical author, of the subject behind this enterprise. And this is the Stοιχείωσις. If you read the whole commentary on Euclid, and not just the Prologues, you will see that Proclus mentions the Stοιχείωσις 100 times, I think it's 98, and he explicitly underlines the importance of this person for the successful accomplishment of the Stοιχείωσις. The Stοιχείωσις cannot be carried out automatically. You can't just have stοιχia, you need someone to put them in the right order. And this is the philosophical personality that we need in this case, and this is the Stοιχείωσις, let's say the Elementator. And as I say in the first bullet, this person is intentionally invisible. He is intentionally at the background. The reason is the following. I think one of the main features of this philosophical genre is that it goes against personal authorities. When you read the Stοιχείωσις, you will not find Proclus saying that Plato is very good, he is very important, this is what he thinks, and this is why we should think he is right. There is no recourse to authorities. What makes the text seem irrefutable and so strong and so coherent is the method it uses, the geometrical method, the succession of strictly connected theorems, mostly elements. And it is for this reason that the author of this text wants to stay invisible. We don't find any explicit reference to names, to authorities of the tradition, exactly because the text has to be able to survive in itself without the aid of tradition. And this is also what makes this text and Stοιχείωσις somehow a historical text, a text that wants to survive only because of its argumentative assets and not because of the author it stands behind it. So the Stοιχείωσις is the subject behind the Stοιχείωσις, the mastermind behind the strategic plan that is carried out in the Stοιχείωσις. And as I said, he is invisible because of the requirements of the philosophical genre. It is this need to stay anonymous, to avoid any explicit invoking of authorities that makes the presence of the Stοιχείωσις so crucial, at least in my mind. And as we can now see in this slide, Proclus, in the main section of the commentary on Euclid, holds that it is very important to unearth what the Stοιχείωσις is good at. So he comments on the commentary, and in something like a second order evaluation, he says that what you have in front of your eyes is successful because of these actions of the Stοιχείωσις. And I have identified certain characteristics. One of them is clarity, the other one is the reasonableness of the Stοιχείωσις, and another one is Proclus' attempt to justify the strategic decisions of the Stοιχείωσις in terms of the exposition of its theorem and of the whole argumentative line. So in explaining what makes the decisions of the Stοιχείωσις clear, Proclus repeatedly says that this person, this author, declared something clearly, or he demonstrates this in a very succinct way, or that the path through which he takes us to the demonstration is very clear, etc. So repeatedly he praises him. He thinks that he is a vital aspect of writing a Stοιχείωσις, and of course he is. But when we translate Stοιχείωσις as stοιχείων as stοιχia, because this is in fact what we do, we reduce this vision to one of its elements, and we ignore the fact that the Stοιχείωσις, of course, includes the means, its means, but is also absolutely dependent on the philosophical authority, even though we don't want to call it as such, that is behind its structure. Because, you know, one of the main problems in this text, in every Stοιχείωσις, is the structural problem. When you write a Platonic dialogue or when you write a treatise, you can more or less divide the writing process in certain parts and gradually develop them. You have a certain freedom, which is absolutely absent from a Stοιχείωσις, as we will see, exactly because of its formal requirements. So the Stοιχiotis is a very important person, is a person without whom no Stοιχείωσις could be written, no Stοιχείωσις complying with the requirements of this genre. So also Proclus says that he's not only clear, he takes reasonable decisions. So he expresses the theorems, he orders them in a reasonable way, and this is the adverb ikotos. So in many times Proclus comments on the decisions taken by the Stοιχiotis, and usually he says that he virtually reconstructs his decisions, saying that this is a very wise decision. He should not say more things, or here he does not say a few things because what is at stake is difficult. He's always ready to let us know why the Stοιχiotis stops at the point he stops, saying the things he says at the position and puts them at the position that he puts them. So in most cases, he admires the Stοιχiotis, and of course, on our part, we could make the same for him in his two Elementationes. But the repeated references to this reconstruction of what the Stοιχiotis does points, I think, to the importance of this personality and shows that that his presence is absolutely necessary for anyone wishing to understand the full potential of the philosophical genre of Stοιχείωσις. And the third point of this second reason is, as I said, the attempt to justify what the Stοιχiotis does, and this is why he repeatedly says, this is why he did what he did, the oper, or he asks himself, why did he do what he did? Tiun etion, why, what's the reason why he did so? And he then gives an answer, almost always introduced with the term the oper. This is exactly why. So Proclus somehow anticipates objections. He tries to say that if you think that there is a problem here, I will explain you why, in fact, there is no problem with what he did. So he knows the challenges of writing a Stοιχείωσις, and he takes the time to somehow protect Euclid, let's say, from the possibility of raising objections against him. Now I would like to again, in the context of this second reason, which has to do with the Stοιχiotis, the person behind the work, I would like to discuss with you some of the challenges that he has to face, and which again underline his importance. And this importance, I think, is included in the general qualification of Stοιχείωσις and neglected when we translate it as elements. One of the most important problems he has to face, as Proclus says in the second prologue, is that he has to order the elements. The Greek term is taxe, tato. I put something in a certain order. But the way he says this implies somehow that the elements are already there. But I think this is a point that is worth of discussion. Is it so true? Are we so sure that the elements are only in need of order and not also in need of being invented? Because when you decide to present an epistemic domain in the way of Stοιχείωσις, the main problem you have is that of coherence. You have to respect the way an Elementatio is written, and you have to make the elements of what follows. So you have to make theorems of which every theorem that follows is somehow causally dependent on those preceding it. The problem here is that each element, each theorem that is element, has a certain intentionality. So it's the element of something. So you can't just say this is an element, you also have to decide of what it is an element. And this chain of necessary decisions, I think, leads you to the fourth bullet, which says that, as I see it, you can't gradually develop a Stοιχείωσις, but you have to have it in your mind, all of it. You just have to put it on paper, but to reach this point, you need to have the whole Stοιχείωσις on your mind without having the possibility of future modifications, because each future modification, any sense of gradually writing it, will destabilize or can destabilize what is before and what is after. So if you have to respect the formal requirements of the Stοιχείωσις, and this is the main challenge of the Στοιχειωτής, your main virtue or asset should lie in your possibility to simultaneously grasp in a very difficult way the whole text, or have in your mind the whole succession of elements, so that you avoid any future destabilization of your work. If you can't do so, you can't have a Stοιχείωσις. So if you can't have a person, if you are not an author of this competence, you can't write a Stοιχείωσις. Because if what I say about the intentionality of the elements is correct, and Proclus somehow points to this in the prologue, in the second prologue, a Stοιχείωσις could be reduced to the third bullet, where I say that Stοιχείωσις is like a process taking us from elements to elements. What I mean from elements to elements is that if you see an element, a real element of a Stοιχείωσις, without its context, of course, this is not an element. It does not have the technical and doctrinal value that is found within the context of a Stοιχείωσις. So what makes a Stοιχείωσις difficult is that you have to transform these formulations, the formulations of the theorems, from elements to real elements, and this can only be done when you have reached the conclusion of your work. Until you reach this point, you can't have a complete work, you can't have a very coherent Stοιχείωσις, and in this case, the formulations that you think they are elements are only, one might say, aphorisms or empty formulations that do not have the status, the high and elegant status, the technical status of being elements of something, of what comes afterwards. This is why I think that to write a Stοιχείωσις, you somehow have to virtually grasp it initially, beforehand, and then just write it. The third reason why I find problematic the translation of Elementatio of Stοιχείωσις to elements. You have already seen that I consider Elementatio to be a nice translation because it captures all these connotations. Comes from the interpretative tradition and in particular from Berthold. I'm not exhaustively familiar with his work, but at least from what I have read, my impression is that he accepts a four-cause approach towards the title of the work of Proclus. And I had already developed this suspicion for the translation before reading these passages. So I was very happy to see that there is a similar reading here. So Berthold virtually says that you have four causes expressed in the title of Proclus. You have Proclus, the author, the Stοιχείωσις, who is one of the four causes behind this title. And you can see it here. He talks about the title and says that Proclus is one of the four causes. And then he finds the remaining three causes in the two words Elementatio Theologica. So in the term Elementatio, I think you can see it here, he finds both the material and the formal cause, because the elements are the material, one of the materials used to carry out an Elementatio. So the elements, the Stichia, are the means, one of the means, but Elementatio, the noun, expresses the formal cause of this vision. And I think this Latin rendering fully captures the Greek connotations I would like to somehow save or protect, the connotations of the term Stοιχείωσις. And of course, the term theologica denotes the specific aspect of the education, the specific character of the educational vision that is here at stake, and this is theology or metaphysics or whatever. In this case, it's theology, as received, as understood by Proclus. This is easy. I think it's the final cause, the end where we would like to, the end we would like to reach. But the simultaneous inclusion of the material and the formal cause in the term Elementatio, I find it very illuminating of what I would like to discuss with you and share with you, because it grasps this transition from simple elements to the action of Elementatio, to the vision of Elementatio. I think Berthold, with all his medieval assumptions, does understand that an Elementatio goes beyond its means, is something broader than its means, is absolutely dependent on an exceptional author, an author who needs a very specific set of exceptional skills to carry out this specific philosophical genre. And Berthold understands that this transition from elements to the vision of Elementatio is something extremely important. Yes, this passage also underlines the final cause found in the term Elementatio. So it's about the divine realm. The divine realm is what is at stake here. And finally, a fourth reason why I find this translation problematic can be found many centuries later. There is this very nice work of Immanuel Kant, which is called Grundlegung zur Metaphysik der Sitten, which is also a Stοιχείωσις. if we accept that Proclus writes the Elementatio theologica as a kind of anticipating the Platonic theology, it is accepted among Kantian scholars that the groundwork or the Grundlegung zur Metaphysik der Sitten anticipates the critique of the practical reason. So there is a kind of parallelism here, only of course in terms of the philosophical genre and the methodological requirements. And it is very interesting to see that in this work we have the same or almost the same translational challenges, because there is a very interesting debate on how this Grundlegung should be translated. By the way, Grundlegung is one of the German renderings of Stοιχείωσις, which I find very nice, and along with Elementatio, probably the two best ways to see the problem here. There is a third way which we will see immediately. So what are the challenges? I will go immediately to the next slide. The challenge is about how you understand the term Grundlegung, and also this takes us to the problem of Stοιχείωσις. When you translate Stοιχείωσις with Stοιχia, with elements, or elemo or elementi in Italian, as I said, you reduce the vision, the educational vision, to one of its means, and you imply that you explain that you offer certain foundations, certain elements of an epistemic domain. While the term Stοιχείωσις and the term Grundlegung include these means, but go beyond them. And as one of the translators of Kant's work says, the term groundwork with which he translates Grundlegung refers not to the foundations, but to the work of laying it. So the problem is not about elements only, which of course are present in this vision, but what is at stake, the vision, lies in what he calls the work of laying it. So there is a work somehow preceding the foundations, the concrete elements or foundations, and it is this work that the title wishes to capture. So one of the English translations of this work of Kant is Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. I think is one of the most accepted ways to render it nowadays. And Alain Renaud, the French political philosopher, who is also very nice, translates Fondation de la métaphysique demeure and not le fondement de la métaphysique, for exactly the same reason. So he understands Fondation as similar to Grundlegung. He explicitly says in the introduction that he intentionally turns against the translational tradition of the French translational domain, let's say. So he translates as Fondation. So we could say that the French translation of Fondation théologique would be great. And he avoids the plural of fondement, because also I think Grundlegung is not in plural, so it would be problematic to attribute a plural where it is not there. So we have a certain consensus in English and French translations. I very much respect and like Alain Renaud. I have a friend who works under his guidance in Paris, and I think he gives a very nice explanation of why we should opt for this reason, for this translation, Fondation, and not Fondement. Just to say, before concluding, that also in Greece we had the same problem. We had the same problem with the same work of Kant. So someone translated in plural, but then another eminent translator explained that it's not about foundations. It's not only about foundations, but about the act of founding morality And this also fits with the content of the Metaphysics of Morals of Kant, which is more concrete and specific in content, while here we have indeed the act of founding, which of course includes foundations. It seems to be reason. For example, in the case of Kant, we know that in this case, Kant focuses on the logical aspects of grounding a morality and on the possibility of having universalizability in our decision of moral principles. But exactly this enterprise corresponds to an act of founding and not exclusively to the foundations that are present in any act of founding. So for all these reasons, which as you can see are both theological, philosophical, and belonging also to the wider tradition, I think that we do lose something crucial when we reduce this strategic plan of Stοιχείωσις to one of its means. I think we should pay attention to what Proclus says. He does not define elements, he uses elements to define one class of theorems, the most important but not the only one. This, along with the presence of Στοιχειώσεις, I tried to explain why the Στοιχειώσεις is an exceptional case of author. He has to meet with to overcome challenges that are unprecedented in writing a Stοιχείωσις if he wishes to make it coherent and follow a strictly geometrical method. So this person is very important, and his art, his competence is part of the Stοιχείωσις. A Stοιχείωσις also focuses on certain educational purposes. It aims to initiate students. So it has many, many reasons to be accurate and coherent from a logical point of view. And Proclus again says that this is the purpose of this work, to στοιχειώσει, to familiarize someone with the most basic principles of an epistemic domain. But to do this in the right way, you have to be a very eminent person, a very skillful author. And this author is present in the Greek term Stοιχείωσις, but absent from the means he uses, from the stοιχia themselves. So for all these reasons, I think we can somehow discuss how we should finally translate this term. Thank you.
It's a very, very good paper. I enjoyed it very much, Thanos. First of all, I should apologize for being late today. It was a personal matter. I couldn't come earlier. I'm sorry.
No.
But I'm very glad that I managed to hear your talk. I enjoyed it very much, honestly. And I learned a lot. I think I have a different understanding now of Proclus. Now I would use the normal term, I mean, or the common translation, the elements. So I have the impression of understanding differently the elements of theology. I don't know if we should adopt quickly or instantly a new translation. I have a couple of remarks or even questions somehow. First, the first thing that came to my mind regarding the Latin tradition, I wouldn't say much about Bertolt because probably Evan or Ezekiel would say something about Bertolt's understanding of Elementatio. But in what concerns the Latin tradition more broadly, until today, I had the impression that it's acceptable to use the term axiomatic wisdom somehow, because there are many medieval authors who would use this kind of geometrical structure, so to speak, with main theorem and then an explanation and so on, or a comment, like Itzhak Israeli, Alan O'Flynn, and so. But now, listening to your talk, I have the impression that somehow it's not accurate to compare the intellectual project or what we can see and understand now from Proclus's works to what the medieval authors did. And there are many points that kind of diverge between Proclus on one hand and the medieval Latin authors. In terms of structure, there is very often, references to authorities, whereas in Proclus, as you just said, there isn't that. I don't think there is also this idea of a pedagogical purpose of scope of the texts that we have in the Latin tradition. I'm not aware of this pedagogical purpose, at least. Also, I don't think there is a progression, not necessarily in a pedagogical term, but also a progression like a spiritual or intellectual, philosophical progression from work to one work to another work in the mind of a medieval author, using the same structure, if you want. Mm-hmm. So there are a certain number of differences that I'm kind of aware of now. I wasn't, I was ignoring them previously. And my question was, you are probably aware of the fact that sometimes Elementatio is, it was translated or changed or used, they used another term. This is institutio, or institutions, theological institutions and so on. You find it even in the English translation of Taylor in the, I think it's late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. I think he uses other institutions of theology or theological institutions, something like this, in the preface, at least, of the translation. He also uses the term elements of theology, but he also uses institution. And also in the Latin tradition, the late tradition, I mean, probably, let's say, 16th, 17th century and onwards, you will find quite a few texts bearing the title Institutiones so either Theologiae or Theologicae, Institutiones Theologiae. And in those cases, these late cases, so 17th century, 16th, 17th century, they are meant to be for young students, or sometimes I think you find it something like Institutiones Theologicae, ad usum scholarium et something, I forgot what. So there is a pedagogical purpose there. I can't remember now if the structure is the same or not, but at least there is this title and this purpose, this pedagogical purpose behind. What could you say to us about institutiones or institutio as a possible translation?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, because I had forgotten this parallel tradition of institutio. I think it's very close to the gravity of Elementatio. I think it could be also used with Elementatio, whereas while at the same time, it's true that Elementatio is a little bit closer to truth, let's say, because it respects this parallelism between Stichia and Stοιχείωσις, elements and Elementatio. So Institutio also has this, it implies that we have something more than the means of instructing someone. But the other term, Elementatio, at least if I read it correctly and in my eyes, is very close to the Greek parallelism between having the elements and what goes beyond the elements. So elements and the Elementatio 100% somehow follow this parallel. But Institutio also respects the difference between the means and the vision of education, I think. But I am not familiar with the medieval, apart from Berthold, I'm not so much familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, you will definitely have in the monastic tradition with Cassian and others, Institutionis Nobitice and so on. So there is this title has been used, where at least there is in the Latin tradition early on already, with the purpose of I don't know. So it's closer to the German term, if you want, closer to the Grundlegung somehow. So there's the basis of something, but also a kind of it has a pedagogical, not necessarily in the terms with this idea of a school, but with the idea of a progression, right? Because at least in the works of Cassian, John Cassian don't have schools, right? You have elders who would present the way they live the tradition. Whereas in Elementatio as such, I wonder if the word as such captures the idea of progression or school, or as clearly as institutio. It's just a question, if you want. It's more like a kind of side, kind of, I don't know, a remark more to myself than a question.
I think that it captures the educational or progressivist or progressive vision just as much the Greek term captures it. When I refer to the educational aspect, I mostly have in mind what we can infer from the prologues, primarily from the second prologue. But it also makes sense in the sense that when you have to teach someone, you need, in the context of an Elementatio or a Stοιχείωσις, you need to familiarize him with the most basic, most elementary, let's say most initial aspects of the epistemic domain, which at the same time seem to be the most important. And another thought that I had in this respect is that a nice way probably to understand Stοιχείωσις is to think that a Stοιχείωσις is a way to test a broader philosophical theory. If you have a broader philosophical theory, the critique of the practical reason, let's say, or the Platonic theology, and you cannot reduce it to a Stοιχείωσις, and you cannot make it dense enough to be hosted in the formal requirements of a Stοιχείωσις, there must be a problem with the broader theory. If you're not in position to transcribe a broader philosophical vision into one that can be hosted in the form of elements, so into one that does not admit of the argumentative rigorousness of a Stοιχείωσις, then something is wrong. Mm-hmm. So we could also say that a Stοιχείωσις is a kind of condensed of an MP3 version, let's say, of a broader theory, one that is supposed to teach and at the same time to guide someone in the basics of a domain.
But it's more than an aphorism in this sense. I mean, sometimes you may find this idea of condensed thought in aphorisms, but it's, I find it's not correct. It's more than that. When I'm trying to I mean, very basic example. Probably it's not the best, but if one would think of Itzhak Israeli, let's say, or I don't know what other author like Alan of Lille or other author who uses this kind of axiomatic, or even Joseph Rome, Teorema Todete Tessenza, and so on. You have indeed kind of condensed thought in very few words. Some of them are clearer than others. But it doesn't seem to me that in all these cases that I just mentioned here, we have more than that. Indeed, an axiomatic wisdom. So there isn't more than that, if you want. Whereas I think that what your paper showed today, to me at least, is that there is a broader scope. That there's a broader scope, or there's a kind of like capturing the entire kind of a wider wisdom, and then you just try to I don't know, show the way to that wisdom. And probably from this point of view, Bertold is a good example. Although there are differences, obviously, because Bertold uses so many authorities that he couldn't write an Elementatio by himself. He's incapable of writing. Yeah, I don't know. It's very dense and very rich what you said, and I think a lot about that. Thank you, Dennis.
I thank you for the discussion. That I'm not so, and for the suggestions. I'm not so familiar with these Latin authors, to be honest. But my main source of thoughts for this educational part, let's say, should be the second prologue, at least as I understand it, and of course the way he explicitly says that the elements are argumentative units somehow that precede others, and these others should harmoniously emerge out of the theorems that precede them. And this is why I said that to achieve this so difficult goal, you can't proceed gradually. You can't write the Republic. It has so many books, Plato's Republic. You can start from the first one. You have it in your mind, but you don't have to have written it. You can have a general outline. But in Stοιχείωσις, if you have a general outline, you're lost. You need everything together at the same time. Otherwise, the axiomaticity will be destroyed, I think. So the connection between elements. This is why I have a great respect for the Stοιχείωσις, and I want him present in the Stοιχείωσις, because if it hadn't, it's not only that if it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't have a Stοιχείωσις. This is clear. It is also that he's an exceptional case of author.
Mm-hmm. I think the only there is one case that probably only one case that I have in my mind, which both in form and also in the broader scope is kind of similar to what he presented to us. I think it's Americus de Campo. I don't want to kind of sell this author constantly, but I really have the impression that one of the well, at least I can't think of another figure in the Latin tradition except Americus de Campo in this. In the case of Americus, whatever text to take from Americus, if you skip the first parts, first three propositions or first two propositions, you can't understand the rest. You can't just open the book and say, well, I'll begin with I don't know, the fourth chapter of the first part and pretend to understand the rest. It's impossible. And he also develops his thought in a very elliptic or like a spiral, constantly referring to what he has said, constantly referring to what he will say, coming back and forth. So that's why it's impossible to just begin at the middle, because he asks you to go back, and he will tell you what he will do later. So this is how he, and this is basically how he unfolds his thought. And when he begins writing from the first sentence, he knows where he will finish. He knows what he wants to say. So it's not really the case that actually once you understood the book or the text, you can find elements of his conclusions already at the beginning or the first part of the text. It's not always obvious when you begin reading the text what exactly those sentences mean together. They become gradually clear once you kind of walk together with Americus, but in the way he asks you to walk and the direction that he asks you to go. I think it's the only case. Now I was also trying to see if Lulus is, because Lulus also has this kind of in some of the works, this kind of somehow axiomatic, or he's playing or he's adopting sometimes this axiomatic structure. I don't think it's always the case, or it's rather rarely the case with Lulus. I'm not aware of many other medieval authors who would be similar to Proclus here. And obviously, Hemericus was one of the biggest readers of Proclus in the Middle Ages. To my mind, I can say it now because it's kind of, it's not public to public. I think there are two main authors in the Middle Ages who really read and understood Proclus. One is Berthold, the other is Americus de Campo. Americus never wrote a commentary on Proclus as such, but his texts are full of Proclus, obviously. Like it's obvious in so many aspects. And indeed, you mentioned Berthold, and hopefully Evan or Ezekiel will step in and say something about Berthold. And the other figure that I would mention here is definitely Americus de Campo.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah. I don't think I see you guys. Let me.
Me too also.
Yeah. Okay. So Eve and Ezekiel. Yeah. Now I can see you now, guys. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and me too. Like Dragos, I'm gonna think about the Stοιχείωσις, sorry for the pronunciation, in a different way now. And I would like to ask you a question. I'm sorry if you said something about it already, but could you say more about the relation within each element, between the relation between the proposition and the demonstration?
No, I didn't say anything about it. So you mean, for example, we have 211 propositions or theorems in Proclus Elementatio. So the question is how the formulation of the theorem is related to the demonstration, if I understand correctly.
how does it work, this demonstration, which is its aim? Perhaps it's obvious, I don't know, but which is its aim within the literary genre that of the Stoikeiosis?
I think this is, I'm sorry, I think this is one of the problems every reader of this kind of work is confronted with. I don't have an explicit or definitely correct answer. The idea, I think, is that there is a succession of theorems, but when we say, but when we use the term theorem, we mean three different classes of theorems. So some of the theorems are elements. These are the most important theorems, and they are supposed to ground what comes afterwards, so that what comes afterwards is does not come out of nowhere. That is, does not violate the intentioned axiomaticity or the axiomaticity that the work aspires to. So a theorem is supposed to gradually build an argumentative step on which later steps are going to be based. But this does not mean that all the steps are equally important, because if you read if one reads the Elementatio, he sees, of course, that Proclus sometimes takes us back to previous theorems. This is made many times. Also in the Elementatio Physica, you can see this. And exactly because of this practice, you can somehow understand that some of the theorems are not indispensable, but are not so crucial for the whole vision of the Stοιχείωσις. It's not the case that all the theorems are equally important. Some of them may be used to facilitate a transition. Some of them may be used, and Proclus says so. Some of them are not doctrinally important, but are put there in order to help the reader turn against those who raise objections. So Proclus says somewhere in the commentary that, not in the Prologues, in the commentary itself, there are some useless theorems, achrista. They have no chria, no use. They have no doctrinal use, but they are very helpful in order to help you reject or answer objections. So a very delicate approach is needed here so that you can distinguish what is doctrinally absolutely necessary, what may be transitional, what may help you move from groups of theorems to other groups of theorems, and also discriminate and also find out which theorems are there just for, let's say, educational purposes, so that they build a certain character in the reader, in the student, a character capable of refuting objections. But this can be found out when you read the text. For example, the seventh proposition on causality and production, it's doctrinally indispensable. You cannot move on without it. And it is clear that this proposition is extremely important for everything that comes afterwards. Similar things could be said for the elements of physics. Also, the sixth proposition, where Proclus says that when you have a multitude, it will be either of unifieds or of enads. This is also crucial, because the enads play a role afterwards. And the sixth proposition is very important as a way to close the first proposition, because in the sixth, he says that he explicitly takes us back to the first proposition, to the first theorem. So there are some internal relations here which can gradually be illuminated, and through which we can gradually understand both connections between theorems and isolate groups of theorems. This somehow is my answer, if I understood correctly the question. And of course, all these attempts take us to the effort of identifying the broader vision of this work, which is not necessarily teleological, as is the case with the elements of physics, but it's a vision in terms of initiating someone in an epistemic field in a certain way. I think for Proclus it is important that he takes you, that he guides you to this epistemic field in the terms he thinks they are the most educationally accurate. He wants your he wants your initiation to be as it should be. And this is what the axiomaticity or the geometrical vision, which is not always respected, of course, wishes to succeed in, and this is the role of the theorems.
Thank you very much. But can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Sorry, Evelina. There is this book which is the book of the 24 philosophers, which also is just loosely structured like some kind of axiomatic discourse, but very loosely, and it has this has the definitions of God and then a brief explanation. The explanation is often quite bad. And there is this Ilaria Parri, this Italian scholar, she says that the definition works somehow as an intellectual intuition, like a noetic intuition, whereas the demonstration or the explanation is built in a rational level. And I wanted to ask you if you could say that it could be something similar with the work of Proclus.
Yes, thank you. The question of definitions is very crucial because Proclus has no definitions in the elements of theology, contrary to the formal requirements of the tradition of elements. In Euclid, you have common notions, you have definitions, etc. But in the elements of theology, you don't. And in the elements of physics, you have some definitions which are immediately used for every demonstration. So, indeed, the demonstration part, the demonstration of the theorem, of course, is rational. This is what we wish to have in a text of this kind. But the way we reach definitions and common notions takes us, I think, to another perspective, because I don't know how we could only guess about Proclus. Since he doesn't have definitions in the elements of theology, I don't know how we could talk about it. What I could say is that the only thing that could be helpful here is relevant to the first principles, which he describes in the Prologues in the commentary on Euclid, namely the axioms. So it is there that I can only see any connection with what you mentioned. Proclus says that there are axioms in any epistemic field. So principles, undemonstrated, initial, which do not only which not only do not admit of demonstration, but which should not be demonstrated, because in this case, things would be more complicated. But he does not use definitions in the elements of theology. He uses some axioms. He does use some axioms which are somehow scattered through the propositions and not always at the beginning of the demonstration. And this is interesting. You can find axioms mostly at the end of the demonstration, coming as a way of contributing to the demonstration itself, but it's not a definition.
Thank you very much.
Eve.
Thank you. So thank you very much for your paper. At the beginning, you said something about authority. So my question is there clearly in Proclus' intentions the opposition between authority, in this case Plato, and the coherence and strength of reasoning? And if so, where is the reason for this choice to be found? You said many things about that, but my other question is this method chosen also to try to offer a product which in the intentions of its author had to be so strong and in itself reasonable as to overcome the opposition between the different philosophical schools?
Thank you very much. As for, excuse me, I didn't hear.
No, thank you. I said again, thank you.
So, thank you. As for the first, of course, Proclus belongs to the Platonic tradition and he has no intention to turn against Plato. What I meant is that he intentionally avoids any recourse to authority. Yes, exactly, because this would not fit with the requirements of the geometrical method, with the requirements of a text belonging to the tradition of the elements. So a text which derives its importance not from the names that it involves, but from the method it uses. I think what makes it crucial, we have here a methodological turn. We have here metaphysics presented in this way for the first time. And this is what necessitates that Proclus does not mention any authorities. Of course, he uses authorities and without naming them. And I just said about something about axioms. Some of the axioms he uses derive, of course, from the Platonic tradition. For example, and also from Proclus' other texts. The Republic, for example, the commentary on the Republic seems to be a source of axioms that are secretly or carefully incorporated in the elements of theology without being named as such. So authority, this does not mean that this is not an authoritative text. What makes it authoritative is its method. The axiomaticity, the effort to be axiomatic is what makes it ahistorical, because it wishes to survive in any philosophical environment. But this does not mean that Proclus is not so good a Stοιχείωσις as to incorporate authoritative named material that the authors, that the readers of his age, of course, could understand in a more easy way than we can. Because they were much more familiar with these things, and every phrase of Proclus sounded different to them than it does to us. As for the strongness, I think this is sorry.
No, it was what I was thinking about. I mean, one, obviously he's coming from a tradition, but one thing is to say, okay, things are so, or because Plato or the Platonic tradition is assuming that, and content, I mean intellectual content, or it is so because I can demonstrate it with this with this new method, that means that you make even stronger that tradition, because when you are questioning about authors and the interpretation of the authors, it seems to me more open the discussion. In this way, it's just like you want to close the discussion. We're not discussing anymore about how to, Plato or Aristotle, or how we can interpret Plato, but this is the truth, and I will show it so clearly that we don't even, it's beyond authority. Is clear, is correct in this way.
Absolutely. I think this is exactly the point in this kind of work. Because, as you said, names are susceptible to criticism and discussion, but this impersonal authority of the method, which tries to provide a very cemented text, a text with no gaps, and a historical text. By a historical, I mean a text that you cannot blame for its historical dependencies, let's say. This kind of text, yes, it wishes to survive and to overcome these kind of problems. And this, what your comment allows me to say a little, just one more thing. No, two more things. The first is the impression of Nicholas of Methone. This is exactly his impression. What he is afraid of is the seeming irrefutability of the text. You can't turn against it. It is so strong. And if you, in the prologue, I think he says that what Proclus wanted to make is a tower that will penetrate the sky. This kind of tower is the text. What makes it a tower is its axiomaticity, the rigorousness of the demonstrations. So from a Christian point of view, the danger lies exactly in this impersonal gravity of the text. A text that for Nicholas turns against the triad. And the second thing, so I think this, what I said about Nicholas also is a response to the question of strongness. The problem is that
he's disconnected. He's back. Okay.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
It doesn't matter what happened, but I hope you didn't lose your idea. We were like, oh.
I hope I haven't. I think I was saying that about the strongness of the argument. I think this was the question about.
Yeah, the tower penetrates the sky.
Yes, I think this is exactly what he wishes to accomplish, and such an accomplishment is less safe if made with authorities, and more safe if the authority is not absent but transferred to the method. And about overcoming temporal and historical debates, we could also discuss the following point: how much inclusive this work is, because we have the method, we have the impersonal authority, we have what I called the educational vision, okay, but there is another aspect which I find very interesting. One of the axioms that Proclus uses is about the good, that all things desire the good by nature. This axiom has a huge history. One of the last phases of this history is a Byzantine commentator, Michael of Ephesus, who understands this axiom, which is a first principle for Proclus, so undemonstrated and indemonstrable. He understands this axiom as an endoxon, as a broadly accepted view. Of course, he's 5, 6 centuries after Proclus, but this interpretative tradition shows that the material that Proclus uses, and some of the most important material that Proclus uses, axioms, were later taken to be dialectical material, because endoxa for Aristotle and for the Aristotelian tradition are the material of dialectical syllogisms. So syllogisms intended to convince. And Aristotle is very is not so clear on this, but he seems to imply that don't take dialectics to be something bad. It could also serve philosophical problems. So this shows that maybe Proclus was aware and intentionally incorporated these assumptions. And we could also probably discuss, exactly for this reason, whether an Elementatio is not only about initiating someone into truth, but also about building a character who is able to defend truth dialectically, so to defeat enemies. And when Proclus says that there are useless theorems, doctrinally useless, but useful when it comes to refutation, I think he's close to what I'm saying. You initiate a student, you make him close to truth, but you want him to be also powerful in the philosophical community. You don't want him absorbed only in contemplation. You want him to be a militant, a guy, one who can protect truth. So this axiomaticity and all the incorporation of all this material could probably help us see this aspect as well.
One short remark, and because it just can kind of follow up this discussion, is that what you just said about the success somehow of the elements of theology is what we see in history. So the diffusion of the text, the transmission, and so on. And it's obviously when one compares to what happens with Liber de Causis, the Book of Causes, the differences are now more obvious to me, and not only in terms of doctrine, but also in terms of scope and so on. This pedagogical, institutional, and so on aspect is completely absent in the Book of Causes. However, there is, I think, what you've just said about the strong arguments that stand by themselves without authority can be applied to Liber de Causis after Aquinas, and this is one of the reasons why I think, without knowing this argument before, I think can be applied to the Latin tradition of the Causes. The success of the Causes after Aquinas is precisely that. Against all historical assumptions, that once people knew that it was not Aristotle, they lost interest in the Book of Causes. What we see is something different. And there are so many authors who simply either accept, like Emericus and others would say, well, some would argue that it's Proclus, others would argue that it's Aristotle, but we don't care about that. We don't care who the authority is. Or in other cases, some authors would continue to attribute it to Aristotle, still assuming explicitly that Proclus is somehow faulty, so to speak, for some arguments or theorems. So despite all these authorities or the lack of authority and so on, the success of the text, because we can still talk about a certain success, is indeed the same idea of a doctrine that is solid because it is beyond authority. It can stand by itself. Themes can be demonstrated, topics can be demonstrated, and the demonstrations are solid. We can agree with them or we can disagree with them, but they are solid. I mean, we can't simply ignore them, right? And I'm not talking only about the commentaries on the Causes, who are obviously numerous, but I'm talking about also, or especially about the use of the Causes in numerous texts, quotations of the Causes, which are countless. It's impossible to make a list of how often the Causes is cited by the medieval authors. It's impossible. So the authority of the text remain beyond so to speak, beyond the lack of authority, of Aristotelian authority. Evan, did you want to say something?
Yes, I would. Thank you. Thanks for that presentation, Thanos. That was very clear and just very thought-provoking. Just a few comments and then a question, I guess, at the end, more comments from the Latin tradition side of things. I would just add to the list, Dragos mentioned the only two who had understood the elements of theology or Proclus. I mean, I think Berthold perhaps and Hymericus, but I think another to mention would be Denis the Carthusian, who brings in this monastic element that you already intuited there, Dragos, but he himself wrote an Elementatio Theologica and an Elementatio Philosophica, which I don't think have really been studied, but in any case, he set out to imitate this genre and became a kind of Stoikeiosis himself after the manner of Proclus. So he's a worthy figure to mention. And I would also argue that Nicholas of Cusa understood this method very well. He just thought it wasn't very, very helpful, or it wasn't the way that Proclus ought to be understood, like everyone had been before. Another point would just be that in the Latin tradition, at least, I think you see the same misunderstandings that we saw with the French and English translators in the modern period. That is, you find in the colophons to manuscripts of the Elementatio Theologica and to Berthold's commentary that they treat the word elementatio as a synonym for propositio. So you would have propositiones procli sive elementationes procli. So they kind of they give the word a plural form and assuming that it's a synonym for a proposition. So already there you can see the same tendency that led someone like Dodds to entitle it Elements of Theology. So, hey buddy, I want to say hi. And here, hi. Okay.
Hi.
The others, Dragos, you know him. The other thing would be that for the Latin tradition, I think there's an important influence of Boethius here that's particularly strong on Berthold, where the theorematic method is not, as you are suggesting for Proclus, a way of initiating people into a discourse, but in fact a way of keeping it secret. So Boethius, right at the beginning of De Hebdomadibus, talks about the theorems as a way of guarding knowledge from a kind of vulgarization. I mean, that's not totally opposed to that is Dragos, yeah. It's not totally opposed to the what you're saying. I think it's reconcilable, but it's at least a very different, emphasis. And I think Berthold, this is crucial for him, that Plato put his philosophy down in theorems, and then the academy came along and used myth to conceal it. So theorems are, as it were, a kind of hidden treasure. They're not an available pedagogical instrument. So that's perhaps an influence of Boethius onto the Latin discourse there. But I think, yeah, Berthold's certainly an ally for your interpretation of Elementatio here as a kind of exercise. I think for Berthold it's crucial that the method itself is part of the pedagogical goal that Proclus is pursuing. And yeah, and this is do you want to go find Mama? No, okay. If you look at section K of Berthold's Expositio Tituli, he introduces the method that Proclus uses by saying, to study these divine realities, one requires an attention, a mental acumen, an attention that is almost itself divine. And for him, the method that Proclus uses in the propositions is exactly as you say, with an aim of teaching a person to see the part in the whole and the whole in the part. Now, if that isn't a kind of participation in the knowledge of divine providence, I don't know what is, but that's exactly what Berthold says, that this is meant to cultivate a divine attention in a person.
Mhm.
So I think that when you say that the Stoikeiosis needs to have the whole always in mind and not at the expense of any part, that's, you know, that, and like for some people, that's exactly what divine knowledge is, right? It knows the whole, but it isn't a abstraction that removes difference. It's a knowledge that holds together the universal and the particular, you might say. So I think those remarks there in Berthold would really be quite, I think they're really important for him. And I think they square well with what you're saying too. So that just brings me to the question I have, sorry about all of that, which is that for Proclus, do you think the elements of theology or theological elementation, as I might try to say now, you know, is a spiritual exercise? I believe Dominic O'Meara has suggested this in a paper somewhere. Would you use that term for it? And if so, do you think it is an exercise that aims to move the mind from dianoia to nous, or in the Latin idiom from ratio to intellectus? That would be that's my question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the remarks before the question and for the question, which is very, very difficult. I think I haven't read the paper of O'Meara on spiritual exercise. I could guess the direction of his thought. I wouldn't be so. I wouldn't easily qualify it as such, in the sense that an exercise, even though I don't really know what exactly he means, but the enterprise of this Stοιχείωσις is too crucial to be taken as a spiritual exercise, and maybe it does not admit of the compromises that could be part of a spiritual exercise. I don't know if it's clear what I'm saying, but I think